The message I'm going to share with you this morning is not a new one. I preached it in the year 2011, the year before I had open heart surgery. Mr. O.B. Easton was a very active member of our church. He and I were good friends. He appeared on my show all the time. He'd sing for me anytime I needed him. And I asked him, I was going to preach about his eyes on the sparrow. That's Mr. O.B.'s song. I asked Lisa, can you dig that out of the archives? She said, oh, yeah. Those of you who remember Mr. O.B., those of you who maybe did not know him, he's going to sing right now, just before I try to preach. His eye is on the sparrow. O.B.?
Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows fall? Why should my heart be lonely and wonder for heaven and home? For Jesus is my comfort. There's no kinder friend than He. For His eye is on that little sparrow, so I know He watches me. Yes, His eye is on the sparrow, so I know He watches me. Whenever I am tempted, whenever the storm clouds rise, when a song gives way silent, when hope within me dies, I draw Him closer to me. And from sin He sets me free. For His eye is on that little sparrow, and I know He watches me. Yes, His eye is on the sparrow, so I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Well, yes, I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. Oh yes, His eye is on that little bitty sparrow, and I know He watches me. Well, yes, I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches.
Oh my, oh my, oh my. Oh my. Mr. O.B. sang bass. That was his voice range. And I shared this at his funeral here in the church. I said, when he got to heaven, the keeper of the gate said, you were singing out on earth. He said, yeah, I want to join the choir. He said, well, all of them are full. He said, well, we get people coming every day. We can start a new choir. He said, that sounds good. He said, tell me what you need. We'll get it up for you. He said, well, I really like those sopranos. He said, could I have 10,000 of them right over there? He said, yes, sir. He said, and I love the altos, the way they blend in. I'd love to have about 10,000 of them right over there. No problem. We can do that, get this choir going. And he said the tenors, those guys who sing way up there, oh, I'd love to get a bunch of them, maybe 10,000 of them. He said, yeah, that's fine. He said, good, I'm ready to start practicing. And the guy said, well, what about the bass singers? Mr. O.B. said, I'll sing bass. Oh, my. Thank you, Mr. O.B. I'll see you again someday. I'll see you again. Let me read the scripture this morning from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 4 through 7. You're so familiar with it. This is from the New King James Version. Jesus said to those who were gathered there that day, and I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who after he is killed has power to cast into hell. Yes, I say to you, fear him. And then are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. His eye on the sparrow. Anybody remember 2011? Okay, good. Be brand new to you, won't it? They did a Gallup poll, try to figure out what people were most afraid of in America. They came up with this. We're afraid of terrorist attacks. We're afraid of spiders. Number 3, it made number 3, we're afraid of death. Failure, war, heights, that's me. Violence, being alone, the future, nuclear war. Interesting that death is only number 3 on the top 10 list of things that we're afraid of. Although the other 9 deaths relate directly to death, don't they? That fear is not just for us folks in the good old USA. Even the disciples of Jesus had this fear. And Jesus spoke to them that day to reassure them. He said, first of all, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. In this passage we just read, he gives assurance of God's providential care for everyone who belongs to him. He says not even a sparrow falls by the wayside that God is not aware of it. 3 things I'm going to say very quickly this morning. Number 1, God's eyes on things sometimes we consider insignificant. Sparrows aren't worth much in human eyes, are they? They weren't in Jesus' day. You could buy a bunch of them for just a few pennies, something like that. It was so cheap. If you bought 4, the seller sometimes would throw one in for free. We may think less of sparrows, even they did. I'm riding down Cody Road over here. One flies up, hits my car, blip, blip, blip. I don't even think about it. I keep on going. They have very little or no value for us. In Jesus' day, when they came to sacrifice the temple, the poorest of the poor, that's what they offered was sparrows because that's all they could afford. Sparrows may not have had much value in Jesus' day or even in our day. But God places tremendous value on them. Here's why. They're part of his creation. He created them. Remember the book of Genesis when he got through creating everything? He sort of stood back, anthropomorphically speaking, put his hands on his hips and looked at all he created and said, it's good. No, he said what? It's very, very good. There's a book, you have to be as old as I am, go back to the 70s, a guy who'd been raised in the ghetto, and I mean, he'd been through everything you could think of, and finally began to achieve some things in life. Wrote an awesome book. If you've never read it, look it up, read it. It's entitled this, I'm All Right, because God made me, and God don't make any junk. I've read that book. Now, sparrows don't have much value, we think, but God made them for a reason, for a purpose. They're teaching us this, that everything that God creates has value. It has a purpose. So if God's concerned about sparrows, and he is, how much more is he concerned with us? We're the highest and the best of his creation. When he created us, he formed us from the dust of the earth. And then he leaned over and breathed the breath and life into us, and we became a living being. No, King Jim language, what? We became a living soul. I know y'all used to short sermons, so if I get too long, just ease on out. I won't be too mad with you. God's even numbered the number of hairs on our heads. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees, they were the most religious people you can think of. They had a large number of people they didn't have to think very much of. Little or no value. They did it, said they're unclean. By the way, they include all of us, Gentiles. A lot of their own people, the last, the lost, the least. They excluded them from society, and they thought in their own eyes they were excluding them from God. I read that, and then I got to thinking the night that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, out in the fields keeping watch over their flocks by night, were the lowest of the low, the shepherds. And guess who the angels came to and announced first that Jesus has been born? The lowest of the low, the ones who couldn't go to temple, who couldn't do any of that, the shepherds. So if God's eyes on the sparrow, he's watching over us. Us, you know how we do that. That's people who look like us, think like us, smell like us, right? That's us. I was up in Atlanta. I used to do all kinds of crazy stuff. And at the old railroad depot covering an event there. And as we left, it was cold weather. We walked outside. It was getting late at night. And there were two guys lying on top of a vent. There was a little heat coming up through it. It's cold. They didn't look like they'd had a bath in 3 weeks. They didn't smell good. You know what we did? We gave them a wide berth. There are people like that in Cordele. The least of the least. How am I going to treat them? I'm going to say, why don't y'all come over to Lake Blackshear Baptist Church and worship with us? Here's one of our bulletins. We go out on Thursdays, beat on doors. Most of the doors we go to, they're folks like us. Who would you contact this week about coming to revival? Hear the gospel be preached. His eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Lesson number 1. Things that I may think are insignificant, God's got his eye on them. All right, thought number 2. We've learned this the hard way. God doesn't always prevent evil from happening to us. His eyes on the sparrow, his eyes on you. He knows how many hairs you have on your head. But he doesn't always stop evil from happening to you. Most of us could raise our hands and say, yeah, preacher, I can give you some testimony about some terrible things that have happened to me. I can look back now and see if it had not been for God's eye on this sparrow, it would have been disaster. If he had not protected me, I wouldn't be standing here today. Not because of my faithfulness. Not because of my goodness. There ain't any. But because he has an eternal purpose and plan for my life and your life. Remember the story of Job over in the Old Testament? Job is as good a guy as you can get. I mean, that you don't get any better, and God had favor on him. You remember the story, Satan goes and wants to say, if you take your hand off of him, then he'll curse your name. And we know everything that happened to Job. I can't remember all of it. We know his children got killed. He lost all of his wealth. He lost everything. And he finally, at the end, he's broke out in these huge sores all over his body, sitting there with a piece of broken pottery, scraping him. And Miss Job, she's been through everything he's been through. She can't take it anymore. And she said, let's just curse God and die. Get out of this stuff. When you get to that place, you've reached the end of your rope. You're thinking, Jesus set his eyes on the sparrow. This sparrow must have fallen off the radar or something. Job, by the way, never did get answer to the question why. He talked to God. Asked God why. God says, Job, where were you the day I created everything? I laid the foundations of the world. Despite being as smart as we are, we got these phones and we can navigate and do all kind of stuff and been off to school and got diplomas and all sorts of stuff. We're still not privy in on God's final eternal purpose. Even the devil doesn't know that. Oh, he knows he's going to wind up in the lake of fire. He wants to cause all the pain and suffering he can in the meantime, and he wants to take everybody with him he possibly can. What the devil doesn't know, that God uses everything, including Job's awful saga, to teach us this. We don't know everything about his eternal purpose. It'll only be on the other side that we'll finally recognize that. Paul says in the famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, he says, now I know in part, then I will know all, even as I'm known. In my former career, I used to go to fairs all the time and festivals and everything and interview people. And I was at one of them, and this guy was weaving a tapestry. And I walked over, I was going to do an interview, and I looked at the thing, and it looked awful. There was knots and pieces of string and everything hanging out. I said, you going to sell this? He said, come around and look at this side of it. I was looking at the back side. And then I saw a beautiful pattern being woven. Right now, we're just looking at the back side. Only when we stand in his presence will we see the plan and the purpose and the tapestry that God's weaving in our lives. That sounds good, preacher. But right now I'm hurting. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. Stay the course. When you come to the end of the way. I use this at funerals a lot. Can't do it all, but a lot of them. He'll say, well done, thy good and faithful servant. Okay. One more quick thought. If God's for us, who can be against us? Now, sparrows, don't worry. You think they were. Here comes Phil down Cody Road again. No, they're not worried about that. There's a multitude of bad things that could happen to them. They don't stock supplies for the future. Remember back during COVID? Don't raise your hand. Did you stock up any bathroom tissue? We couldn't get in our bedroom for it. They don't stock supplies. Yet, their lives go on. Sparrows work. They don't worry. What happens next week? I ain't got a clue. Sparrows don't strain to see in the future. They were doing a thing about gambling out there. The association said, we need to preach about gambling. I said, I can't. I gamble. You do? I said, yeah, I'm in the stock market. I've got a guy who guides me in that. And he tells me what the stock market is going to do next week, next month, and next year. He's just a sophisticated fortune teller. He doesn't really know. But God knows what's going to happen next week, next year, this afternoon. Habakkuk, the prophet from the Old Testament, in the midst of turbulent times, said, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive tree may fail, and fields yield no food, and though the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the Lord of my salvation. I read a lot. I really do. I'm a reader. I just don't know much. But this thing I do know, one thing. If God's for me, who can be against me? Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I have no clue what's going to happen the rest of this day. God does. And His eye is on the sparrow, and He's watching us.